they've just set the precedent of being able to completely block not just a world leader, but, one of, if not the most powerful world leader from communicating in a major, what is increasingly becoming kind of a public square. And that precedent is scary as hell.
Welcome to Unlatched Mind. My guest today is Dr. Christopher Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson is a professor of psychology over at Stetson University down in Florida. Chris and I talked about all things censorship, the slippery slope that is censorship, really. We touched on the most recent, efforts by Facebook and Twitter to, shut down President Trump's account. And we just we talked through a couple examples of Target removing some publications from their shelves, due to some controversy, and if it ever makes sense, right? Is censorship ever okay? I think it gets really nuanced and really fuzzy. But anyway, great conversation. I enjoyed it. With that, let's jump in. Dr. Christopher Ferguson. Well, anyway, Dr. Ferguson, I appreciate your time today, and I like I said, I ran across your blog on Psychology Today, and it just jumped out at me. You cover a bunch of different topics, but the one topic that I think was sort of timely is just the overall censorship in general. Recently, what's happened with Facebook and Twitter and shutting down Trump's account and all those things, you can't not, it's top of mind for a lot of us, but. Mm-hmm. So, and you had, I don't know how many specific articles you had, but there was two that jumped out at me, and I think we want to summarize today, and I sent you those notes on that, but we can go anywhere with the conversation. But I'd say before we kick it off, maybe just introduce yourself and give the listeners like a little quick bio of yourself.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Chris Ferguson. I'm a professor of psychology at Stetson University, which is indeed named after the hat guy. He had a bucket load of money and donated it and got a university named after himself. I should be so lucky someday. And I'm a clinical psychologist and actually have been doing research on things like video games, video game violence and addiction and all that kind of stuff for nearly 20 years at this point. And I think that's kind of what got me interested in this topic of free speech and censorship and all of that, is looking at that area and looking at all the historical calls for censorship or regulation of video games with this idea that it was necessary to protect the public in one sense or another. And so that made me interested in how these kinds of calls for restriction of speech happen and when they are not warranted, but outside of that, I'm married. I have a 17-year-old son. We live in Orlando. I love Disney, but I can't go right now because of COVID-19. And otherwise, I'm a big geek. I play Dungeons and Dragons. I play guitar. I don't know
Nice.
What else. That's about it. I'm actually not a really super fascinating person, but I just do research, I guess, in areas that people are interested in.
Yeah. Dungeons and Dragons. You just called yourself out big time there. Now there's plenty of people listening that are like, yes, whether they're out or out of the Dungeons D&D closet or not. I think there's a lot of fans out there. A lot of us geeks out there. Trust me. But anyway, your first article, the bad retraction. Now I know there's two articles you wrote. The second one I was a little more close to. I guess her name was Abigail Schreier. That book. And I had just listened to several podcasts on that whole thing, so I have a little more opinion on that one. But I guess going back to your first article that I had sent you, the bad retraction. Excuse me. What was just let me summarize the basic point of the article, and then we'll kind of dig in.
Sure. So this was an article that was published in Nature Communications, which is a journal, which is a very prestigious journal in the sort of nature universe. Nature is one of the top journals in the world, basically. And essentially, this article looked at the publication history of junior scholars. And they were interested in looking at whether what they termed informal mentorship had a link with sort of the success of publications for these junior scholars. So they kind of had some very specific metrics and very specific outcomes that they were looking at. But the sort of TLDR, not getting too far into the nuts and bolts of it, was basically among a bunch of other things, they had concluded that for junior women scholars, that being informally mentored by senior women scholars did not result in as much success for their sort of the citations of their articles as being mentored by a senior male or groups of senior male scholars. And of course, this went against a grain of thought that was promoting sort of female mentorship and such, and the idea that junior women scholars would benefit highly from being mentored by other women as opposed to men, and that created this huge. Well, I mean, at least for us in this, I'm not sure that the average person at home noticed this, but for us in science, it kind of created this huge outcry on Twitter. As you might imagine, there was obviously a moral component to this article, and a lot of people were very, very upset. And as a consequence, there was an open letter that was passed around of scholars, and a lot of scholars wrote to the editor of this journal. And so there was a movement to basically get the article retracted because it published something. Now, of course, it's framed in the sense that there was a fatal flaw in the article. So that you can't say I don't like this article, so please retract it. But it was sort of framed in the sense of there are these fatal flaws in the article. But it certainly was this obviously emotional, moral outcry because the article concluded something. And the article was written by a woman of color, by the way. The lead author was a woman, which is kind of interesting. Little, people might assume it was a guy who wrote this. It wasn't.
Right,
it
a
was,
white Christian male must have written it. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it was this, this kind of story of something unpopular was published that was data-based. It went against acceptable thought, if you will, and created a predictable outcry on social media. And in this case, the journal, in my mind, unfortunately, and that's not because I necessarily love the article, but unfortunately the journal editor did decide to retract the articles. And of course that has since created, probably not as much of an outcry, but it has created some introspection about the nature of retractions now. Is it appropriate to retract a piece of science because some segment of the scientific community or just Twitter mobs, which are not necessarily separate things, didn't like it, didn't like the conclusions that were made in the article. So at this point, the article is retracted, but it's not clear to me that the rationale for the retraction was appropriate. And again, it's not because I'm neither condemning nor condoning the article itself, but it does seem like we're heading into this period where retractions are increasingly being used to police thought in science, if you will, that if you publish findings that go against what is acceptable thought, that you may face the humiliation of having your article retracted, even if it is not fatally flawed. It may have some flaws in it, but flaws that many other articles have. And that, I think, has a fairly significant potential to chill the kinds of scientific inquiry that people will make, or the conclusions that they'll be willing to make based upon their data. So I think that this tendency is going to hurt the objectivity of science to some degree. So I'm pretty worried about it.
Yeah, I mean, now you did kind of say this, but was there legitimate? Because I mean, you also say throughout your articles, which I think you're spot on with, that you never want to shield any scientific journal or article or anything like that from. You never want to shield that from being analyzed and criticized. If there's bad science anywhere, that's the whole point of peer review and all that, right? I mean, that's you never want to protect any article, whether it's PC or not, I would think, or any publication. Right. Now, was there anything, I mean, you mentioned they cited some flaws in it. Was it, in your opinion, the flaws were just, I mean, they were using that as an excuse because they didn't like the political correctness nature of the outcome? Is that sort of?
I think that is the subtext, yeah. So, yeah. I mean, I think that, so retractions are typically used for a relatively narrow set of situations. They're not used because a paper is imperfect or has flaws. They're usually used if there's fraud. So if someone just made up their data and that gets discovered, which happens sometimes in science. And they're also used when there is a serious error. So let's say, someone ran their statistics and published their findings, and then later they go back through their data and they realize that they miscoded something, or they, had, two different research assistants and each of them entered the data differently somehow. I'm thinking of examples off the top of my head, but a clear error. And that error created the findings rather than there being sort of, an internal truth to the nature of the data. So if someone finds, either they themselves find it, or when they share the data, another person finds that there is just a blatant error in the way that the data were entered or coded or analyzed. And that can, sometimes some scholars will themselves take it upon themselves and say, look, we made a mistake and we'd like to retract the article. Sometimes there's another scholar that discovers the error. So those are really the two situations, sort of blatant error and fraud are kind of the major situations where you see retractions.
Right.
In this case, there was no allegation of either of these. There was no allegation of there being fraud. There was no allegation that the scholars involved in the study had made a blatant error. The concerns came about the operationalization of the variable. So they kind of looked at mentorship as these, publication pairs. They would look at like scientific articles and try to figure out, who were junior scholars and who were senior scholars. And they kind of, made this sort of assumption that could indicate, what they're calling informal mentorship. A lot of people objected to that, and said that that's not really a great measure of informal, mentorship. And so I think a lot of the major, or at least the concerns that were talked about in the retraction kind of focused in on that, was the way that they measured informal mentorship, valid or not. Now, I think that's a valid point of criticism. I think that it's certainly something that should be open to dialogue, to discussion, that, some people may be skeptical that that is a good way of, and I'm fine with that criticism. But usually in that situation, when you see criticisms of the way that people try to measure something, which are actually incredibly common, particularly in the social sciences, almost, if we were to track every paper that had concerns about how something was measured, there would be almost nothing left, basically. Right, so it's a very, very common concern about almost, all articles that are out there. Usually in most situations where there's that kind of concern, it's handled in what's called a comment response format. So what happens is, person A or group A published a study, some group of scholars disagree that study really can be used to make the conclusions that it did. They, in a comment, list out their objections to that study. And then in a response, the original authors get the chance to sort of defend their work once, again. And that's kind of like the normal way that scholars will kind of dialogue when there's controversy over whether an article is sort of basically internally valid, as we call it. In other words, there were no major mistakes in the article, but we're not sure if it's externally valid. We don't know if it really sort of applies to the situation that the authors initially claimed. And I think if Nature Communications had done that, I think that would have actually been good. I think, again, we don't want to say that nobody can ever criticize this article. People should criticize the article, and oftentimes we can come to this understanding that maybe this article, is an incremental piece of the puzzle, doesn't really fully answer the question that we're interested in, but nonetheless isn't really fatally flawed and should still be part of the record. And that whole debate should be part of the record. And unfortunately, that's not what happened in this situation. So, now we have a situation where an article, had perhaps some legitimate criticisms, but was not fatally flawed. And the retraction sequentially happened after this massive sort of like social media outcry. And it's difficult to see it in any light other than a lot of people get upset by an unpopular finding, and the journal censored it because of what we want to call it, groupthink, political correctness, whatever else. And that's scary because now you're going to get a lot of other authors who are going to look at their data and say, do I really want to publish this if I'm going to be humiliated, internationally in this case? And you're going to get a lot of garbage science as a consequence. People are going to rerun their analysis until they get, palatable findings, or they're just not going to publish anything at all, or they're just going to stay away from a particular research field. And none of these are, good outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, science doesn't give a crap about political correctness. The data is the data. Now, if there's biased measuring and biased, approaches to measuring the data, then okay, we should call that out immediately. But barring that, the data is the data. I mean, if assuming this was done, as we think it was, on the up and up, that's data we all should want to know. Men, women, all of us, right? We'd want to know that, and it might, like you said, it may not tell a complete story, but it's a piece of the puzzle. Perhaps we can create better mentorship programs based on that. You know what I mean? It's silly to me. Now, but do you remember it was the bell curve by Charles Murray, when he, that reminds me of this. And I remember that one was huge, right? And just for the listeners, right? Charles Murray wrote, I think it was a book, right? Yeah, it wasn't a documentary. Yeah, it was a book, The Bell Curve, where he was basically relating IQ and race and trying to figure out if there's a correlation there. I think the result of the article was not very politically correct, or the result of his findings, I should say. Now, the critique that I remember that jumped out at me, that I always remember, that was pretty much folks saying what was the genesis of his interest in that, in those studies, meaning they were kind of playing the card where you were going after this to prove some, maybe a predisposition to think maybe whites are smarter than blacks, or whatever. That was their criticism of him, not like he just ran into the data by accident because he was doing something else. And and there was something there to think about, whether he was, I don't know anything about his past or his history. I don't really follow him, so I didn't know if there was any validity there. But drawing back to this article, were they specifically trying to figure out if males or females made better mentors, or is that just part of one of the many different things that this study found?
Yeah, my recollection, it was really one of several things that the article happened to be looking at. So there was kind of like a bigger picture of mentorship relationships that they were interested in examining. And I don't think there's anything, to my mind, in the tone of the article that suggested that there was some kind of, moral agenda that the authors had. I mean, like I said, the lead author, was a woman of color. So, which, people would argue, of course, that doesn't mean you can't be sexist, or whatever else.
Sure.
But no, I mean, I think, at least, my recollection from reading it, and I read it probably back in November, was that, there wasn't anything in the tone that it was certainly like on the surface. The reading of the manuscript was less controversial by far than the bell curve. And I think like with Herrnstein and Murray, they didn't just look at these kind of like IQ differences, but they attributed it to genetics, which is a pretty loaded thing to do naturally. And I don't think there was anything quite, to my mind, to that level in this particular article. And in fairness, I mean, the article is really only looking at one aspect of outcomes related to mentorship. It was kind of looking at the sort of like citations and impact of articles. But the argument, of course, is mentorship, involves a lot of different things, and a lot of different outcomes. It doesn't necessarily mean that, the women who have the best citations or whatever downstream, it's necessarily where the happiest in their careers,
Right, exactly.
And, so even if we take the article at face value, and like I said, I think, it's fair to criticize it. So maybe, you can make the argument we shouldn't take it at face value, but even taking it at face value, I think it only really captured one aspect of or try to capture one aspect of mentorship. And there are many other outcomes that I think could balance off the picture more. So I think there were better ways of, if people were, so I've been involved in like video game research for a long time, and so there's a field that to my mind is littered with bad studies, but there are better ways of dealing with that than just saying like this study made me upset and therefore needs to not exist any further. Replicate it. If you think that the scholars did a bad job with their operational definition, the way that they measured their key variables, then fix it in a future study, and come up with a better study, or measure things in a different way. I mean, so I think there are ways of tackling this problem without using retraction as a kind of censorship aspect. And the reality is that most scientists aren't going to read one study and think that like their entire worldview needs to change now. But there is this sort of perception, and I think it gets amplified on social media to some extent, the perception that if an article finds something that goes against the sort of acceptable political grain, that it's going to do sort of quote unquote great harm. And sort of the harmfulness or the perceived harmfulness of an article needs to be considered in regards to its, whether it survives or not in the scientific record. And that was actually a point that the retraction, or excuse me, actually was the editorial that the journal had written following the retraction, that they spoke to that very specifically. And they made, and I don't have the wording right in front of me, but they made a statement in their editorial that they were now going to have the equivalent of what people talk about in fiction as sort of sensitivity readers, but they basically were going to say that, for groups of people that may be harmed by an article, that they're going to essentially select reviewers, from those identity groups to try to, limit harm, if you will. But that sort of raises the question of, we might say, well, maybe that sort of makes sense, for, certain people, certain identity groups, maybe they need better representation. And I think most of us would agree that representation is good. But like, what about an article that suggests that conservatives are less intelligent than liberals? And there actually are plenty of articles that say that. Should we go out of our way to get a conservative reviewer, for that? Because that article may, quote unquote, harm people's self-perception or other people's perception of conservatives and things like that. And then where are you going to get these conservative reviewers? Because there aren't many.
Yeah. Oh yeah. In academia. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And no, it's an odd one. And I think some of the, I've heard other folks that would back up, this level of censorship by saying, well, if you come out with a study that, like the Charles Murray study, you're just going to invigorate the racists. Okay, well that's okay. That in itself is terrible. However, the problem is the racist and their warped mindset on how they view people because of some color, like some stupid thing like how dark or light their skin is. Right? That's just a silly thing that eventually that mental illness will go away and we'll all just not care. Hopefully, but whether it's that or whether you're going to encourage the sexists among us because you're saying men are better mental. Well, that's not the data's fault. That's the sexist fault, right? So it's like you can't. Right. Now, it should be considered, but you can't warp data to, you can't go back and adjust like the reality of things. Again, assuming the metrics that for a lot of these studies are done honestly with intellectual, integrity, and you can't change that or even hide it or even diminish it in any way. The data's data. Science shouldn't care. I think it's a tough one because there's marginalized groups all out there, and you don't want to do more to further marginalize them or but. Yeah. But the science, that shouldn't be a science. That shouldn't be you can't adjust data. You just can't. I don't know.
There's a great example for that one too. And there is this kind of like debate in science about, do scientists have responsibility for how their data is used, if you will? In other words, should we, I don't think people would say it quite this bluntly, but there's a sense of like, should you publish something if that thing is true, but it might be somehow misused or, be of a disadvantage to a particular group or something of that sort. And there was just this summer another article that got retracted. It was by Johnson and colleagues in PNAS, which is the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And it was looking at, sort of race in police shootings and such. And so at least as I understand it, and I wasn't like super intimately involved in this, just kind of watching it from afar, but the original article basically concluded that sort of the race of officers doesn't matter. So in other words, minority officers are as likely to shoot minority, suspects as are white officers. But apparently, at least as I understand it, it got misquoted. I think Heather McDonald is kind of, who writes a lot of op-eds, and I think she wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, kind of reversing that and sort of saying, well, this article concluded that race of the suspect doesn't matter. So in other words, there's no difference in police shootings of particularly Black Americans versus white Americans, and that wasn't what the article actually found. And I think the criticism is that the original authors in their original article worded things in such a way it could be misinterpreted. Again, I think there's a lot of inside baseball here that I probably don't know necessarily, but anyway, after this op-ed was published over the summer, the article got retracted, and basically the argument, and I have the retraction notice in front of me. I was looking up before this podcast. Is they basically said that we're concerned that this article is being misused, that it's being misrepresented in the news media, essentially, and they retracted. At least the retraction notice sort of highlights that, and maybe there are other, like I said, this is, maybe there are other really bigger flaws somehow that didn't get highlighted in the retraction notice, but the retraction notice basically said that this got misused in news media and therefore retracting it so it won't get misused, which again seems like a very odd reason for a retraction and kind of a scary reason for retraction. I mean, I sort of understand the concern. I don't necessarily disagree with the concern about, news media sometimes misusing science. I think that happens all the time and is a valid concern. I don't know if erasing the scientific record itself is the correct answer.
Right. Yeah, no, I see what you're saying, and I think I agree. I mean, you brought up a good point, though. I never really thought of it that way, and I appreciate that perspective. Yeah, the data may be used to hurt folks, right? And I think maybe it's not the scientists' jobs, right? Their job, I think, should be to just find what the data shows. But maybe there's another level in there where it's where maybe there's some effort to because there's bad actors everywhere, and bad actors are going to use that data for bad. I guess maybe as a society we have some obligation to work on that, but not hiding squashing the data or erasing the data is just that's not the answer. But it's interesting. There might be some adjudication of that data afterwards, of how it's presented or how it's shared, or but that's slippery. I mean, how do you it just gets slippery, really slippery. But
yeah, I think it does. I mean, and it does seem to be the sense of this happens more. I mean, and part of my concern is not just that we're getting rid of articles that have some flaws in them. I mean, again, I think in some of these cases the flaws don't merit the retraction necessarily. But also we're doing it for unpopular findings, and we're not doing it for popular findings. And that is going to cause a distortion of the scientific record. So there is this concern that science is going to be increasingly reduced to the sort of cheerleading effort for sort of morally popular worldviews. And that's really in large sense the opposite of what science should do. Exactly, science should be objective and open to challenging even popular worldviews, and science should be protected from that.
Exactly.
Kind of like the whole point of tenure and things like that, is to sort of make it possible for scholars to sort of challenge these very popular worldviews and such. And to the extent that we're now like undoing that, whether that is, retraction of these, they definitely may be imperfect articles. I'm not necessarily rushing to the defense of these articles, but, their flaws don't seem to be different from the flaws of most studies that are out there. And we're retracting them because they don't fit with a particular worldview. That this has become, I think, and of course, there are these efforts to kind of like, I guess the word these days is cancel, which is maybe not a very precise word, but, that some scholars are, seeing their livelihoods ruined because they've said, not just something like threatening on social media, which might be fair enough, but, but have challenged against sort of popular moral narratives that their jobs are being challenged. That's, I think, is a dangerous trend for science in general, because popular worldviews can be as harmful as unpopular ones, right? And if we're going to police just one side of a debate and sort of give the other side a relative free pass, that is as likely to do harm to individuals in the public as, only challenging, these unpopular worldviews is going to do. So I think and one thing that's going to happen is, of course, is just people are going to notice it and they're just not going to trust science as much.
Right.
If there isn't this perception of science as being brave enough to withstand these types of criticisms, then people are going to take notice and be less likely to trust science at all, which, we might say, well, maybe unlike, I'm trying to think, video games, that doesn't really matter. So if science is rubbish on video games, we know a lot of science is rubbish on video games, but if science is rubbish on video games, who cares, right? But if we get this sort of perception of science as being rubbish, that is going to matter on things like, vaccines, and right now there's at least some anecdotal evidence to suggest that a high proportion of first responders are refusing vaccines for COVID-19, and where does that come from? It probably comes from the distrust of science, at least in part.
Yeah.
It probably comes from a lot of, garbage messaging about, the anti-vax movement and that kind of stuff as well. But so it's complicated, but, sort of setting up a situation in which people, have a good reason to distrust science as being objective is not a good thing.
Yeah, and it's going to
keep. I think we need a bit more bravery around some of these articles. They should be criticized, but not retracted.
Yeah, and scientists that want to, I mean, scientists have a career. They're trying to grow a career as well as do really good science, right? So and the two things kind of can actually be polar opposites or be opposing forces. If you're about to stumble upon some really good finding that is going to be potentially career killing, what do? You have to make that decision where, you have to be lucky that the breakthrough you're going to find is going to be, a perfectly politically correct, aligned with the perfect, the political correctness of the day. Otherwise you risk, having your career hurt, hindered, canceled, whatever. That's not good. I don't know. It's a tough one. If gravity's there, whether you believe it or not.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, that's what I try to tell my students too, is that, reality doesn't have to conform to our moral, beliefs, our moral worldview and that kind of stuff.
Right.
And usually the more sure you are about how the world works, the more wrong you probably are, is the reality of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I like that.
I mean, the world is nuanced, right? Things are complicated. I mean, almost any issue you take, things are incredibly complicated. But people like these very simple worldviews. They like black and white. They like good guys. They like bad guys.
Yep.
And it's hard for people to understand that oftentimes these like really sort of like big narratives are not right, in that the reality is more complicated, the reality is more nuanced, and it's kind of hard to create these kind of like good guys and bad guys and moral crusades based around that. And so people are less likely to sort of embrace that narrative of complexity. I mean, we can see this in our politics, right? We have basically two sides.
I was just going to say that. Yeah, I was just going to bring that up. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, exactly. And that's why.
And I hang out with more liberals, not surprisingly, being in academia, but so you can see it on both sides. And so right now, and justifiably so. I mean, the right is getting a lot more criticism because of the mobbing of the Capitol Hill and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of hate there, and there's no question about that. But I see people on the left doing more or less the same thing. Not mobbing Capitol Hill, fair enough, but
I mean,
certainly putting,
that's why I say you brought up nuance and however nothing's black and white, and you're 100% right. And I'm on this new kick. I'm telling everyone, unless you're in politics, you should be a centrist, because there's no way you believe all of this or all of that. You don't. You can't. If you do any kind of thinking, you should. The odds or the statistics would be, I think, as close to zero as statistically possible that you believe any of one side, well, all of one side, I should say. It can't be. I know you have to identify, and actually come voting day, you have to pull one lever or the other, but I think we should all be just thinking centrist. And I'll tell, and the way I've been talking about it lately is it's really boring here. It's just not that exciting. Like it's not very tribal. You don't get to pound your fist and high five people. You just get to have open conversations with folks like we're doing right now. And it's like, you know, we're not going to say they, them, and us, and we don't get to do that thing. But I guess it's I don't know. I just think we should all be centrist, to be honest. But not in different issues, you can pick a left or pick a right. But in general, someone's like, are you conservative? Are you a liberal? Like, well, what's the issue you're asking me about? And I'll tell you how I feel about it. Otherwise, I can't give you an answer. It just doesn't make any sense. But anyway, let's jump to the next. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, well, it's fun to smash your enemies, right?
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. But I think, well, yeah, we have that in us. I mean, especially as guys, but I think you should save that for like the the heavy bag or the gym or something. You know what I mean? It's just, I mean, I don't know. But it's just
it's fun to smash your enemies, but it's kind of hard to run a country that
exactly.
Way, when
good point. Good point. Yeah.
So that's something to think about. Yeah.
Anyway, so burn this book. The next article, the next blog you had written. Now this one I had, like I said, this was about the book that Abigail Schreier wrote, and the title was "Irreversible Damage: The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters." Now I had. Your article was timely. I had just listened to 2 or 3 podcasts on this, and where she was on and just talking about what had happened. And, she seemed, in my opinion, who knows what's behind the scenes, but from my opinion, she seemed like she had absolutely no ill will at all. She seemed like the most caring person that has absolutely nothing against the LGBT community at all. So I guess if you could just kind of summarize this article as well. It's a similar discussion we'll have here, I think, but it's maybe a little bit different.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so there really are kind of like 2 interesting, aspects. And I've I read the book a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, somewhere around there. And I actually I kind of had a mixed reaction, to the book. In fairness, there are some things that I think are potentially valid about what she's saying. I had some things that I was more concerned about the science that she covers in the book at some points as well. So, I mean, I think that here, to be very clear, that people that are critical of the book, I think they have grounds, for being critical of the book. For people who are upset by it, people have the right to be upset, by it. And I in no way take that away from people that, if it angers them, then I think they got their reasons, However, that my concern again was the efforts to effectively, whatever the word we're going to use, censor, ban, deplatform, whatever it may be. But the effort that caught my attention was, again, a lot of this stuff happens on social media, but it was a social media effort that was at least briefly successful to have the book removed from Target's website, so you can no longer buy the book through Target. There were some issues around Amazon as well. I think my memory is that Amazon refused to advertise the book or something of that sort. And it was brief, like for an afternoon, it was successful. That Target removed the book, and then of course there was a predictable outcry about sort of like book banning and such, and then Target sort of returned. Now someone pointed out to me somewhere that I haven't checked back in the last few weeks, but Target kind of returned it, but made it hard to find. I think so. It was technically back on Target website, but it was very difficult to look it up, or it wasn't available. It was technically there, but it was sold out or something. So I'm not exactly sure.
I'm on Target site right now. I typed in IRRE into the search bar, and it's the second hit. Let's see. So
it is showing up now.
Yeah, okay. It's not that hard to find.
Maybe it just sold out or something, but it looked like it got memory hold for a little while there, even though it was technically back on the roster and such. So that's good. That's good. I mean, I'm glad that they did, definitively bring it back then.
Right.
In the end. But so there were 2 issues with that. One is, I think that in this situation, now I am not heavily invested in either side of this particular debate. I want to make that clear. I support trans rights, to be very clear. I think, we should respect, trans people's lives, their preferred pronouns, et cetera, et cetera, but I think in this situation, there were 2 kind of issues. Is one, the effort to, ban, censor, deplatform, what we want to talk about, drew much more attention to the book than would have happened if they just left it alone. So there is this concept called the Streisand effect, that basically says if you want people to not watch or read or consume a form of media, don't talk about it.
Right.
If you show how upset you are by it, you actually make people more interested in reading it because they want to see what the fuss is all about.
Right. And that's how you came across it,
so there was
right?
that aspect of it.
I think you had mentioned that's why you ended up finding it and reading it, right? Because of the content.
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
I probably would never have read this if it hadn't been for the effort to stop me from reading it. And then the other is you lose the moral high ground with these things. So most Americans are still pretty opposed to book bannings, even of controversial books. Again, there may be some very, very extreme exceptions, but this wasn't one of them. So for the most part, Americans do not like being told what they can't read. And such. They're very, I think, most people are open to criticisms. So here's a situation where I actually think there are valid criticisms of the book, to be very clear. And I think had, individuals, and I'm actually working on a book review of it that hopefully will get published. And I have some of those criticisms in there.
Oh, cool. Okay.
I think that had people focusing on, criticizing, offering criticism of the book, I think a lot of people would have been pretty open, to that. The moment it switched to, and in fairness, I think it only was a few individuals, so Target kind of caved quickly to a few people on Twitter.
It doesn't take many, does it? It's crazy. Yeah.
If
you're backing the right issue, you only need yourself. If you're backing the right, if you say that if you're with the right group, that's for sure.
Yeah. And, so I think that, by moving into this sort of room of book banning effectively, that loses the high ground and gives the advantage, in this case, to Abigail Shrier. Now she's the victim, if you will, of a censorship effort. Maybe she doesn't deserve that victim status. I don't know, but now she does have it and she isn't enjoying it, at this point.
Whether someone agrees with the book or not, that should be an open debate, open criticism. If she was hateful or whatever, then she should be criticized for it, and the open market will definitely do that. But in terms of the censorship, that's getting to First Amendment type stuff, and it gets scary. I mean, that gets but hate speech is it gets into that world where it gets, like you said earlier, it's all nuance. But
well, I think it's people will point out like that. Companies like Target or Amazon are private entities and they're not bound by the First Amendment. But, and that is absolutely true. But on the other hand, once they make this decision to have a book that they're going to cover, they, in my opinion, are essentially, ethically bound to defend it, at that point. To then deplatform it largely goes against their reason for existing in the first place. And the real concern, we have to remember, like, the free speech is not just the First Amendment. The free speech is a bigger issue. And particularly as we're getting into these concerns about like big tech companies like Amazon and Facebook and Twitter and how much control they have with speech, we really need to get beyond this idea of only thinking about the First Amendment as the sort of limitations of free speech. But it is going to become, I think, problematic if we give these companies the ability to deplatform anything that's unpopular, because once that begins, it's going to encourage more of the same. So if these kind of Twitter mobs, whether they're concerned about Nature Communications article on mentoring, or they're concerned about Abigail Shrier's book on sort of trans issues, that if these kind of angry mobs get rewarded for their efforts with the sort of censorship or deplatforming or whatever else of an unpopular form of media, that's going to make them more likely to do it in the future. So we're going to see more and more and more of this over time. And the sort of, spinelessness, if you will, of some of these companies like Target in giving into these mobs are going to make it more difficult for, I think, and yes, this is going to be like a slippery slope argument. It's going to be more difficult for a wide range of authors or scientists to publish things in the future, because we're all going to be looking warily at these Twitter mobs.
Right. Well, mentioning Twitter, I got to ask you as we kind of move on here, but what are your thoughts on Twitter and Facebook banning, blocking Trump or removing his account, whatever they did, deactivating his account?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll be upfront and say I think anybody who's read any of my work would know that I'm not remotely a Trump fan. I think he is likely to go down. I talk a little bit about him in the book I just written, How Madness Shaped History. I think he's likely to go down as not, if not the worst president in American history, as one of them.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of aspect, like it couldn't happen to a nicer guy, and certainly his use of his platform, not just in the last 2 months, but I would say over the last 4 years has been incredibly irresponsible. But on the other hand,
but you could separate that your personal feelings about him as you can separate that from whether or not, you think they should have banned him, right?
Yeah. On the other hand, there is this precedent that, and I'm not saying necessarily that Amazon and Twitter acted in bad faith necessarily in the situation. I mean, maybe they did, but I don't know necessarily what was going through their minds. But they've just set the precedent of being able to completely block not just a world leader, but one of, if not the most powerful world leader, from communicating in a major, what is increasingly becoming kind of a public square. And that precedent is scary as hell, and it is, and people sometimes will point out that this is kind of one-sided. Like, I think, most of us would agree. And I think even a lot of people who are conservatives would now agree that Trump has misused his platform in a lot of ways and said and done some dangerous things. But what about China? What about the leaders of Iran? Or why just this one individual? Is it being applied in a way that makes sense? Is Putin being silenced by Facebook and Twitter for saying and doing irresponsible things? And do we really want these companies to have that level of power? A lot of their efforts to block content, to essentially remove participants, to cancel accounts and that kind of stuff. They're non-transparent. A lot of them are done by machines. It's not always clear what recourse to challenging that decision there may be. So I think we can always kind of say, well, Trump kind of deserved it. I don't know that I would necessarily disagree in principle with that perspective. But once the door is opened, that sets this precedent, and giving that much control to these largely unaccountable, multinational tech companies is also kind of a scary thing. And now that precedent has been set. So there again, I think, and people point out the same thing. Well, these are private companies; they're not governments. So the First Amendment, they can do whatever they want. That's exactly my point of why this is so scary.
Yeah, right, exactly.
That we need to think about these kinds of issues of free speech beyond simply the First Amendment, and giving these companies, which are not yet as powerful as governments, but they're getting there, giving them that much control over our speech, I think is going to be a real challenge in the next few decades. And it's really going to require us to start thinking of censorship as not just being a government issue. That'll always still be important, of course, but now becoming an issue of big companies, and how much control do we really want to allow these big companies over our speech and our lives and our ability to communicate, and things like that. And we don't have that legal precedent right now about how to deal with that. And also people assume that there's a clear divide between these big companies and government. And that's not always the case. The governments themselves can put pressure on these companies to do things. So there can be kind of a governmental end run around things like the First Amendment by pressuring these companies to move in one direction or another. So I don't think things are as simple as saying, well, these are private entities and therefore everything's, hunky dory and we shouldn't worry about it.
Right.
I think we definitely should worry about it.
Yeah. And because then you get to the, I do think it's dangerous. And it just reminds me of the whole, saying like, I hate what you're saying, but I will defend your right to say it. Mm-hmm. It just for me, that just always rings true. And Trump's, if he's the crap he was saying on Twitter through those last 4 years has been, it's horrible. You use the Twitter is just terrible. Sorry, it's not what a president should be saying, or the tone is wrong, but getting back to your point, and the reality is, these tech companies are all left leaning. It's very one sided. So now, who's making that decision of what should be banned and what shouldn't? It's in this case, the incitement of violence, and it's a little bit more almost justifiable. I still don't like the fact that any of the censorship happened. My personal opinion, but you could almost see. Okay, well, the violence was, there was some insight of violence that at least folks are claiming. So it seemed like it had the best interest of society at heart. But what happens when it's a little more nuanced than that? And who's making this decision? I mean, and you're right. It's a lot of AI that's doing it. A lot of times, it's not all just people hitting a switch. So it's scary. But I love your position, by the way. Like you would hate the guy or hate his policy or hate him as a president, but defend his right to say his crap online. You know what I mean? I think, not saying that's exactly what you said, but you kind of in that land. But real quick,
there are ways of dealing with politicians, and that is to vote them out of office, which is what we did.
Right. We have a system for that. Exactly. Yeah. He doesn't think that we did, but anyway.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Fake news. Real quick on the video games thing, and I really wanted to touch on that, and then we'll get to your book. I want to definitely touch on your book here as well. But the video game thing is, and we don't have to spend too much time on it, but this is near and dear to me. I got 2 young kids, 5 and 7. They're addicted to screens. We're always trying to find that balance. I'm a computer engineer by day. I'm staring at a screen all day. How bad, I guess, is screen time for children? And is there a lot of scaremongering out there and scare tactics? That's I feel like there's a lot of that, but I don't know the science, so I never studied it. But what are your thoughts there?
There's a lot of scaremongering around technology and screens, of course. Yeah, and this is nothing new. Of course, you can look back throughout history and see that people have this tendency to be panicky when it comes to media, new technology, in a bunch of different realms. People talk now about video game addiction. Addiction, not really even a good word, but I'm going to keep using it because it's just the word everybody uses. But if you look back in the 1940s, there were actual research papers on radio addiction, which is fascinating. So people were talking about similar issues, back then. Sort of the big bullet points. There's no evidence to suggest that playing violent video games causes, any kind of serious aggression or violence. It doesn't relate to mass shootings or anything of that sort. Small percentage, maybe 1% to 3% of people may overdo technology, but that's probably because of their own internal psychological issues, not anything about the technology. Because you can find people that overdo a wide range of activities. It's not just technology.
Sure.
So there doesn't seem to be anything unique about technology that makes it more addictive than exercise or sex or shopping or work or all the other things that people overdo. There are even research papers on fishing addiction, which is fascinating, and dance addiction, which is fascinating to me.
I don't have that.
And one. With most of these things, like anything, you kind of want it to be in a balance. You want to make sure your kids are getting enough sleep. You want to make sure that they're getting at least some exercise each day. Yeah. You want to make sure that they're happy. And that they're getting their schoolwork done. And as long as they kind of hit those bullet points, then your kid is fine, and getting panicky because they're playing a bunch of Fortnite, with their friends, particularly in the middle of a pandemic when they can't see them in person. It's probably not terribly helpful. So it's, a big fuss, but without much data to support that this is something, we need to worry about. But unfortunately, this is a good example about how it's hard to write a news article about that. Some and in fairness, some journals have done it, but it's really kind of hard to write a news article and say, everything's fine with screens. Don't worry too much about this. Whereas writing an article like, screens are rotting your child's brains, and we're going to have a mass wave of problems, following the pandemic because of this increase in screen time, which the New York Times just did, by the way.
Yeah. If it bleeds, it leads.
That sells more, right?
Of course. Bleeds, it leads. Yeah.
So again, there are kind of these incentives around supporting these panics, even if the data don't really line up to suggest that this is something that we really need to worry about too much,
But on the flip side, though, now are you basically focused on? Is that data mostly around does violent games and does violent video games or anything cause real life aggression? Or so it sounds like you were touching on that, but are you talking on in general that screen time is not addicting?
In general. The data in general do not suggest that screens have these kind of massive deleterious effects on kids the way that we've always kind of thought, for decades and decades.
Now, my kids, but everyone I know, and I just got to play devil's advocate here, and I'd love your perspective on it. But my kids, all the kids, people I know, all my friends, family, the kids in the especially younger kids, the screen is like crack to them. It seems like it's like crack. I mean, you take it. I mean, what's going on there? There's something there. I mean, I'm a software guy, and the way they write these games, they have psychologists on staff to if you make a sound when the player walks through this door, they're going to get more money, and it's going to flash, and it has to make this sound. If it makes this sound, it's going to cause a dopamine bump. That's all real, is it not?
Well, like we use the example of the dopamine bump there. You just
yeah.
I always cringe a little bit when people start talking about dopamine in this sort of thing. So,
hey, if I was completely wrong, you can just say it. I love it. Like that's why I'm asking the question, because that's what you hear, and I've kind of read it too.
You're not completely wrong, put it that way. Okay. With a little that emphasis on completely. So what happens is. So things like video games and technology don't give you a dopamine bump. What happens is whenever you're anticipating doing something fun, you naturally get a spike in dopamine. Mm-hmm. And as a Disney World fan, I always use the example of if you're in line for one of like Space Mountain, something like that, like one of these rides that are like really the premium rides. And you're waiting like an hour in line, and it's a drudgery and it's terrible. But then eventually you get to the front of the line, and that feeling of like, oh boy, I'm about to get on the roller coaster. That's the dopamine rush.
Right.
Or even calling it a rush is kind of a the words we choose are somewhat scaremongering a little bit.
Hyperbole,
but it's a very normal reaction.
Yeah,
it's a little boost in excitement when you're anticipating doing something fun. What actually happens is when you actually start engaging in the activity, that dopamine level decreases.
Right.
So you'll notice that the anticipation of Christmas is a lot more fun than Christmas, and the anticipation of the roller coaster is sometimes more fun than the roller coaster itself. So that's what's happening. It's a very normal process, and so people when they're like you can show this response for anything, so, the person who's about to, get on the floor and dance, the person who's going into work and they love their job, that anticipatory dopamine elevation is a very, very normal response. And so people kind of make it sound like this is like methamphetamines, sort of a thing. And the reality is the kind of dopamine response people get from like video games or other forms of screens is largely identical to other normal activities that are fun.
Gotcha.
It's a very normal, fun response. And so what you get with screens is screens are fun. It absolutely is true that, a lot of tech companies use psychologists, and in another world, I almost wonder would I have preferred to have been one of those psychologists, because I'm sure their jobs are a lot of fun.
Yeah, sounds fun, doesn't it?
Playing,
it does.
Playing video games all day and stuff, But they're there to make the game or whatever it is more fun, more engaging is probably a better way of thinking of it, and that kind of stuff, which is not necessarily, a bad thing for them to do. So people will tend to gravitate towards fun stuff, So like, the kind of questions I get, I always get a kick out of some of the questions I get from parents. My favorite one is, why doesn't my kid, show as much interest in his homework as he does in his video games?
Because homework is boring and video games are fun.
Do you remember homework?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
When did kids ever gravitate towards homework? The problem is not video games. The problem is homework.
Right.
It
was when we were younger without video games back in the day, we rode our bikes and didn't do our homework. Or you keep going back in time. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Parents will ask, why does my teenager want to spend so much time on social media with their friends and not talking with their family? Because you suck.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in a harsh way, but it's just so their teens viewpoint, you're dull.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They don't want to talk to you. And that is a fairly normal teen thing.
Right.
Teens have never wanted to talk to their families.
Right. In the 50s, it was the same. There's just no social media. They were just sneaking out the back door to be with their friends.
So things aren't going to change if you take away the technology. Your teen is still going to be, sullen and ignore you. They're just going to find something else to do, so that they don't spend time with you. And I put that kind of harshly, but and I did that.
No, I mean but I know your point. It's like, who wants to hang out with their parents when they're teenagers? Nobody, literally no. I mean, it's like there might be a couple, but
exactly. So, I saw this documentary on Netflix, The Social Dilemma.
I was going to bring that up. That's I wouldn't say it shaped some of my thoughts, but it certainly solidified some of them. Maybe
it's garbage.
Really?
Garbage.
Oh, interesting.
It's unscientific garbage. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's actually very well done. It's very, very slickly produced. Absolutely, but in no way, shape, or form in tune with the actual science.
Really, very interesting.
Area. Very scaremongering documentary, and unfortunately, they had one psychologist on. The only person that had any actual psychology, any actual science knowledge. Psychologist by the name of Jonathan Haidt, who I respect and I admire. He's done a lot of great things in psychology, but unfortunately, on this issue, he's wrong. so it's kind of like a little side thing. He does a little bit of stuff on like social media and screens and suicide, and his view. And like I said, I have nothing against him, but his view in this area is a minority view. And unfortunately, the documentary didn't have any other scholars on there that would have, at least added balance, to what he was, saying. So that is a common problem with documentaries, of course, is they themselves have their narrative they need to sell. They're not there to inform you. They're there to sell money. And that's exactly what this documentary did. It's in fear sells. So they present this very, very scary message about, like you mentioned, dopamine and this idea that there's a cabal of researchers, turning social media into crack cocaine, and it causing suicide and all kinds of other stuff. And it looks like the stuff that people did with Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s and rock music in the 80s, and people made the exact same claims. And nobody thinks that Dungeons and Dragons or rock music from the 80s has these effects anymore. And people are going to, come to that realization with social media, as well. And that doesn't mean that social media doesn't have its challenges. I mean, I do worry about like the privacy concerns, of course, the speech concerns, as we've been talking about. I do think that there are issues with social media amplifying the most extreme voices in our society, so that people think that they're more normal than they actually are. So, increasing polarization and stuff like that. So, I mean, I don't have like this rosy view of social media necessarily, but this idea that it is like similar to like methamphetamine, that is causing suicide in girls and this kind of stuff. The evidence does not in any way support those particular types of concerns that the documentary unfortunately chose to focus on.
Interesting. No, I appreciate that perspective. I most of the documentary I bought hook, line, and sinker, so I'm gonna have to do some reading here. Now they did the other things they did talk about, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but we are the commodity, right? They're using our data. The platforms are free. That's tough to challenge. Am I wrong there? I mean, that's, whether or not it's correct. Addicting, So I think your point is, yes, it can be addictive, but it's just on par. It's on par with all the other things people get addicted to. So let's relax about the whole, it's not unique in that sense. So that's an interesting perspective. But in terms of the reverse echo chambers that they provide, where if whatever I believe, they're going to just keep pumping more things in front of my face. So I start doubling, tripling down on my beliefs because I'm not seeing the opposing views. Like all that stuff is something where I see concern. And they touched on that as well. So, but I guess I got to do some reading on that, because I love the documentary. You're right, it was very, very well done, but sometimes you have to remove the production value from the underlying content, right? But interesting. So tell us about your book. Let's wrap this up in a few minutes here. But I skimmed the kind of the summary that you had sent out. I think it's a fantastic topic. So when did the book come out, by the way?
It came out at the best possible time for a book to come out, which was right at the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic. No, I'm being sarcastic. That was the worst possible time for a book to come out. So because all the publishing houses closed and made a mess out of things. Yeah, now it came out in March of this year, and so the book is How Madness Shaped History, and it's pretty much what it says on the tin, basically. So obviously I'm a psychologist, but I'm also interested in history quite a bit, and it's kind of like when we think of like what would I have done different with my life? What would my alternative life path have been? And I'm enough of a geek that instead of being an academic, I would have been another academic, apparently, and that I, would have been a historian instead of a psychologist, I guess. But this is an opportunity to kind of look at both issues. Cause I've always been fascinated with history, and there had been this kind of like line of thought. Well, it still is around, and I think it has some value. There was this line of thought that kind of issues like geography, natural resources, plagues, and we're in the middle of one right now, so we can kind of see with the value of this argument that these things shape societies more than individuals do. And I actually think there is something to that, but on the other hand, I disagreed with sort of the totality of that, in the sense of I think individuals do matter, that sometimes in particular in crisis points, the actions of individual politicians, leaders, whoever they might be, do have an impact on society. So we can see this right now. Obviously, COVID-19 is having an impact on our society, and at the same time, so did Trump. And I don't think we would, say that neither of these were critical for how 2020 shaped up, which is to say badly, for most of us at least. And so my book was kind of geared towards sort of looking at that issue, making that point, but doing it in a way that I thought was fun, which was sort of like to take some of the most horrible people in history and look to see how they stepped into some of these moments in history, had an impact, and just made a disaster of it. Whether we're talking about sort of like the typical people think about, like the Hitlers and the Stalins and the Maos and stuff, but also looking at maybe some lesser known figures, like some of the Roman emperors who were kind of wacky, and some kings and queens who were perhaps not in the proper mental status. But so it's a book that kind of looks at a lot of these case examples, comes to some speculative diagnoses about what might have been happening for these individuals and why their madness, if you will, had a usually negative impact on their cultures, their societies, their nations, and it's generally written to be a lot of fun, So,
no, it looks fantastic. I mean, it looks super, super interesting. I'm definitely going to pick it up. I mean, and where can folks find it?
People can find it in any online bookseller, your Barnes & Noble, Amazon. Nobody has tried to cancel it yet.
They haven't heard this episode yet.
Maybe somebody needs to get a banning campaign going to draw more attention.
Yeah, exactly.
Nothing sells a book like a good book
controversy.
Guess,
Yeah. Excellent.
And it's available in stores. People are brave enough to wear your mask, but so it's usually available.
No. You say don't wear a mask and go get it. There's the controversy. Just kidding, folks. Just kidding. Well, Chris, this was awesome. I really appreciate this. This is you got me thinking about this about the social dilemma. I gotta look into that now. But anyway, well, I really appreciate the time. This was fantastic. Anything else you want to leave the listeners with? I think we.
No, this has been a lot of fun. I appreciate the opportunity to be on here. Yeah, if listeners want to follow me, you can follow me on Twitter. Now that we've talked about how terrible Twitter is,
exactly.
They can still follow me on Twitter if they want to. And my Twitter is CJFerguson1111. They can also check out my website, which is just my name. It's ChristopherJFerguson.com.
Cool. And I'll put those links in the show notes so folks can just see it. Get it right firsthand there.
Sounds good.
All right, Chris. Appreciate it. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
You too.
All right,
thanks
so much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.